The only question now is whether Venezuela's government or economy will completely collapse first. The key word there is completely. Both are well into their death throes. Indeed, Venezuela's ruling party just lost congressional elections that gave the opposition a veto-proof majority, and it's hard to see that getting any better for them anytime soon or ever. Incumbents, after all, don't tend to do too well when, according to the International Monetary Fund, their economy shrinks 10% one year, an additional 6% the next, and inflation explodes to 720%. It's no wonder, then, that markets expect Venezuela to default on its debt in the very near future. The country is basically bankrupt. That's not an easy thing to do when you have the largest oil reserves in the world, but Venezuela has managed it. How? Well, a combination of bad luck and worse policies. The first step was when Hugo Chávez's socialist government started spending more money on the poor, with everything from 2-cent gasoline to free housing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good idea in general, but only as long as you actually, well, have the money to spend. And by 2005 or so, Venezuela didn't. Why not? The answer is that Chávez turned the state-owned oil company from being professionally run to being barely run. People who knew what they were doing were replaced with people who were loyal to the regime, and profits came out but new investment didn't go in. That last part was particularly bad, because Venezuela's extra heavy crude needs to be blended or refined, neither of which is cheap before it can be sold. So Venezuela just hasn't been able to churn out as much oil as it used to without upgraded or even maintained infrastructure. Specifically, oil production fell 25% between 1999 and 2013. The rest is a familiar tale of fiscal woe. Even triple-digit oil prices, as Justin Fox points out, weren't enough to keep Venezuela out of the red when it was spending more on its people but producing less crude. So it did what all poorly run states do when the money runs out: it printed some more. And by some, I mean a lot more. That, in turn, became more lots than you can count once oil started collapsing in mid-2014. The result of all this money printing, as you can see below, is that Venezuela's currency has, by black market rates, lost 93% of its value in the past 2 years. Now you might have noticed that I talked about Venezuela's black market exchange rate. There's a good reason for that. Venezuela's government has tried to deny economic reality with price and currency controls. The idea was that it could stop inflation without having to stop printing money by telling businesses what they were allowed to charge, and then giving them dollars on cheap enough terms that they could actually afford to sell at those prices. The problem with that idea is that it's not profitable for unsubsidized companies to stock their shelves, and not profitable enough for subsidized ones to do so either when they can just sell their dollars in the black market instead of using them to import things. That's left Venezuela's supermarkets without enough food, its breweries without enough hops to make beer, and its factories without enough pulp to produce toilet paper. The only thing Venezuela is well supplied with are lines. Although the government has even started rationing those, kicking people out of line based on the last digit of their national ID card. And it's only going to get worse. That's because Socialist President Nicolas Maduro has changed the law so the opposition-controlled National Assembly can't remove the central bank governor or appoint a new one. Not only that, but Maduro has picked someone who doesn't even believe there's such a thing as inflation to be the country's economic czar. When a person goes to a shop and finds that prices have gone up, the new minister wrote, they are not in the presence of inflation, but rather parasitic businesses that are trying to push up profits as much as possible. According to this let me be clear theory, printing too much money never causes inflation. And so Venezuela will continue to do so. If past hyperinflations are any guide, this will keep going until Venezuela can't even afford to run its printing presses anymore unless Maduro gets kicked out first. Last week, protests turned violent in parts of the country where demonstrators demanded empty supermarkets be resupplied. And on Friday, the government said it would continue its truncated workweek for an additional 15 days. Continue reading the main story. Advertisement. Continue reading the main story. There's been plenty of problems, but one thing I haven't seen until now is protests simply to get food, said David Smild, a Caracas-based analyst for the Washington office on Latin America, a human rights group, referring to the demonstrations last week. The growing economic crisis fueled by low prices for oil, the country's main export, a drought that has crippled Venezuela's ability to generate hydroelectric power, and a long decline in manufacturing and agricultural production has turned into an intensely political one for President Nicolas Maduro. This month, he declared a state of emergency, his second this year, and ordered military exercises, citing foreign threats. But the president looks increasingly encircled. American officials say the multiplying crises have led Mr. Maduro to fall out of favor with members of his own Socialist Party, who they believe may turn on him, leading to chaos in the streets. If and when that happens, Venezuela will hold its collective breath. Anything could happen, from a straightforward palace coup leading to a relatively orderly transition to, in the worst case, an open rift between more or less evenly matched parts of the military, leading to the kind of conflict you shudder to even picture. Venezuela is out of food. After several years of long lines, rationing, and shortages, the socialist country does not have enough food to feed its population, and the opposition government has declared a nutritional emergency. This is just the most recent nail in the beleaguered country's slow, painful economic collapse. Many people expect an economic collapse to be shocking, instant, and dramatic, but, really, it's far more gradual than that. It looks like empty shelves, long lines, desperate government officials trying to cover their tushes, and hungry people. For the past 2 years, I've been following the situation in Venezuela as each shocking event has unfolded. Americans who feel that our country would be better served by a socialist government would be wise to take note of this timeline of the. Many began to suspect that the outlook for Venezuela was grim when prepping became illegal. The Attorney General of Venezuela, Luisa Ortega Diaz, called on prosecutors to target people who are hoarding basic staples with serious sanctions. Shortly thereafter, grocery stores instituted a fingerprint registry to purchase food and supplies. Families had to register and were allotted a certain amount of supplies to prevent hoarding. Then, just over a year ago, it became even more apparent that the country was falling when long lines for basic necessities such as laundry soap, diapers, and food became the norm rather than the exception. Thousands of people were standing in line for 5 to 6 hours in the hopes that they would be able to purchase a few much-needed items. But that wasn't enough to keep the population fed. Isn't it astonishing how much less motivated people are to produce food and supplies when they are no longer allowed to benefit from their hard work? Historically, collectivism and farming have never gone successfully hand in hand. This January, the government told citizens that they would need to produce their own food. The Ministry of Urban Farming was created to oversee this. While self-reliance sounds great, it isn't so great in Venezuela. Just so the urban farmers don't get too self-reliant, a registry of the crops and livestock will be required. And obviously, they've already proven that they have no issue forcing farmers to hand over what they've produced. Now, it looks like all of the socialist measures and forced food production haven't been enough to keep the people of Venezuela fed. The country is in so much trouble now that it isn't possible to cover it up with propaganda. collapse first. The key word there is completely. Both are well into their death throes. Indeed, Venezuela's ruling party just lost congressional elections that gave the opposition a veto-proof majority, and it's hard to see that getting any better for them anytime soon or ever. Incumbents, after all, don't tend to lean to free housing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good idea in general, but only as long as you actually, well, have the money to spend. And by 2005 or so, Venezuela didn't. Why not? The answer is that Chavez turned the state-owned oil company from being perfect to do too well when, according to the International Monetary Fund, their economy shrinks 10% one year, an additional 6% the next, and inflation explodes to 720%. It's no wonder, then, that markets expect Venezuela to default on its debt in the very near future. The country is basically bankrupt. That's not an easy thing to do when you have the largest oil reserves in the world, but Venezuela has managed it. How? Well, a combination of bad luck and worse policies. The first step was when Hugo Chávez's socialist government started spending more money on the poor, with everything from 2-cent gas. The only question now is whether Venezuela's government or economy will complete